Hi everybody, it's Laura from Green Tree. I am here today to talk about greens and the different things you can do with them besides just making salads, because frankly sometimes salads get a little bit boring even when you're an adventurous salad topper. So first thing I'm going to do is run you through a few different kinds of greens and what makes each one unique. The first one I'm going to show you is chard. Chard is kind of interesting. It's got these slightly thicker stems. They actually come in a lot of different colors. This is kind of delicate because it's winter chard. They can be fatter and look almost like celery. It's got a softer leaf. The texture is sort of like a juicier spinach. It's not as hard and hearty as kale. This will cook relatively quickly. You don't have to cook it for long periods of time, but you might want to saute it a little more than you would with, say, fresh spinach. Chard has a slightly earthy flavor, almost like beet greens, if you've ever had those, but it is otherwise like a typical fresh kind of green flavor. You can eat it raw. A lot of the time people choose to cook it. We've also got, whoop, I hit my cord. You guys just pretend I didn't do that. So I also have lettuce. This is a romaine lettuce. You know, you will often see like romaine hearts, which is this thicker kind of base area on the romaine. Romaine is one that you would typically use in a salad, but it can handle a little bit of light heat. So this is one that if you wanted to, you could like kind of chop this up roughly and toss it in at the end of the cooking process with something like a pasta salad or a bean salad to add a little bit of extra crunch and green with something that doesn't have to be cooked on its own because it's ready to eat as is. Now, of course, I have kale because you can't talk about greens and not talk about kale. This is green kale or winter boar kale, curly kale. It's got a lot of different names. Kale has a lot more of a fibrous structure to it. You can see those thick stems on the inside, and this is something that actually is going to require cooking. Unless you want to use a method where you kind of massage it with vinegar or another acid to help break it down, you were going to probably want to cook it. It's pretty chewy if you just use it straight up. You can, but it's kind of an acquired taste. Then, of course, we have kind of the classic is baby spinach. This is one of the most versatile greens, and a lot of the suggestions I'm going to have for you on using greens are going to focus on baby spinach. You can grow this even when it's really pretty cold out. We're going to start seeing local spinach again really soon here, and you can put this in anything from sweet to savory, and spinach will just disappear right into it, or come to the forefront if you want to make it the star. Then we've got microgreens, which are really good. Microgreens are tiny little sprouts of other types of adult greens, including some of the things that I have here today, like chard and kale and spinach. Arugula you will see in these a lot of the time, other kinds of colorful lettuces, but they're basically baby greens. If you let these grow larger, they would turn into a whole bunch of different kinds of greens. In this case, they're just blended together as a fun, easy way to add some greens to whatever you're making. And then we also have, so this one is actually a spring mix. You can kind of see the colors in there. There you go. Let's just show you from the front. But this has got some little purple guys along with some different types of greens. You can get mixed greens that are for cooking. You can get mixed greens that are for salads. You can really use them a lot of different ways. Something like this I would probably either use for a salad or in sandwiches. They're great just tossed on top of a really hearty sandwich before you slap that second slice of bread on to add a bit of extra texture and nutrition. So I'm going to kind of run through some of the interesting ways you can use these different greens. Like I said, mixed greens like this are great in sandwiches. So are things like spinach or even something like microgreens. You can kind of sprinkle them on the top and give it a little extra crunch and oomph without having to put in too much extra time with the kind of the chopping when you use the small greens like this or the spinach. Pancakes are another great way to use greens. I know it might sound kind of weird, but baked goods actually take greens really well. I've got an example here. It's a little spinach and cheese scone. So scones, pancakes, biscuits, you can use delicate greens like spinach and microgreens without having to do additional separate cooking beforehand. If you want to use the heavier greens in something like this, you're going to want to saute it first, chop it and saute it first to get some of that extra liquid out and to soften soften it up a bit before you mix it into the final product. Smoothies are great for this kind of stuff. I really recommend using spinach in your smoothies. If there's a lot of fruit or chocolate in your smoothie, the spinach will just disappear. You can use kale and heartier greens like that, but if you're going to use those in your smoothies, you want to have a really strong blender, or else you're going to have little chewy bits that are going to show up in your teeth later, which is fine, but just be aware that it could be a problem. You can also mix these things into sauces. One great way is to puree them with like an immersion blender into something like an Alfredo, a creamy sauce. You can also chop these greens, any of them, including the hearty, sometimes hard to deal with kale, and throw them into things like marinara sauces. Anything with tomato in it has some nice acid that will help break these greens down. You can actually put them in chili too for the same reason. Chop up your kale, toss it in there, cook like you would normally, and you're good to go. Another thing that you can do with greens, and this will work with pretty much any of the greens that I showed you, except maybe the romaine lettuce, is frittatas, quiches, scrambled eggs. You do not have to be making some kind of fancy omelet to put spinach in your eggs. You can just kind of tear it up with your hands a little bit, toss it in as you're scrambling those eggs, add a little bit of color to your breakfast, a little bit of extra nutrition as well. You can also do tacos. I love to put chopped greens in my tacos. You can even use chard for that. You can put this in your tacos. I prefer the lighter colored chard for things like tacos because it doesn't have quite as strong of the earthy flavor. The red and orange colors, in my experience, have more of that beet flavor, which you might not necessarily want in your tacos. Basically, if you're going to use a green in something, taste a little bit of it raw, see what you think of the flavor, and then you'll know whether or not it's something that will mix well with what you're making. You can actually use different kinds of greens in Stam Pot. I did this in another video where I talked about how to use squash, but you can make Stam Pot with any kind of green as well. Stam Pot is a Dutch dish where you take your big bowl of potatoes, let's pretend this is potatoes and not mixed greens, and you take your cooked greens and you smash them in with a potato masher or a stand mixer if you have one, and you just mix them right into those mashed potatoes. It gives it a nice bright pop of color. It's still going to taste just as creamy and delicious, and the only thing is, like I said, if you're using kale or a heavy green like that, cook it a little first before you mix it in. With something light like spinach, you could actually just take it and mash it in, and the heat from the potatoes will be enough to cook it. And if you haven't tried Stam Pot with squash yet, look that up on our website. It's delicious. It's also covered in the squash video. You can juice your greens. That's really a quick way to get your greens. You're not going to get the fiber, but you're going to get all the other antioxidants and micronutrients out of the greens by doing that. You can go over to Pure Vitality if you want to go someplace downtown. They make a lot of juices, or you can pick up the greens here and run them right through your own juicer. You can even do that in a high power blender if you add some other liquid. You're just going to want to strain some of that fiber out, or else be prepared to kind of chew your juice a little bit because you're going to have some chunks. Then you can take and put your greens into ramen. I actually really like spinach in ramen. You can throw it into other kinds of pasta dishes too because it's so delicate. The heat from the pasta will be enough to cook it, but I really like it in ramen because spinach, when you don't chop it up first, is really easy to pick up with chopsticks. So spinach is a good one for ramen and other pasta dishes. I like to throw it in with things like a little bit of chicken sausage if you eat meat, mushrooms if you don't. It goes well in dishes that have things like feta or other kinds of salty toppings. Spinach will just add a little bit of color and a little bit of interest to your pasta. You can also put any of these into casseroles or hot dish. If you haven't made a casserole before, you are essentially taking some kind of creamy base and whatever else you have and want to put in there. Often there's a pasta or rice component to it, and baking it all in a cake pan. Hot dish is the same thing. Another way you can do it though is to get hash browns or mixed root vegetable hash, which we do have here and you can find other places, and take that and greens and use that as your base instead of the carbs that you would get from the rice or the pasta. You're going to get these less refined, more fiber-filled carbs from the potatoes and other root vegetables, and then you're going to toss in your spinach or your chard or your kale and chop that up with your creamy sauce and make that the base of your casserole. It's really satisfying. It's going to stick with you for a bit longer because it has a higher level of fiber, and you can use pretty much whatever you have in the cupboard to make that. Or I guess the refrigerator. You probably shouldn't store all of your fresh vegetables in the cupboard. That's another video though. So let's see. Oh, burgers, meatloaf, and meatballs. Kale holds up really well to that, and so does spinach. But if you chop it either in a food processor or just kind of semi-finely by hand and mix greens like this into your meat-based dishes like that, it's going to add some extra moisture. It's going to add some extra nutrition and a little bit of extra bulk. Because as you cook them, this kale will soften up. It'll release a little bit of moisture into the dish. And for the most part, so long as your seasonings are good, you're not even going to taste that. It's just going to give it a little more color. Pizza. I love to put greens on pizza, especially spinach. I know I keep showing you guys the spinach, but I will put a whole layer of spinach across the top of my pizza. It shrinks down so much as it cooks. You don't really end up tasting it much along with the other toppings that you're typically going to use. And it adds a big punch of nutrition to something that otherwise is not all that healthy. Since it tends to be a lot of refined grains and cheese. But if you add a whole bunch of greens to the top of your pizza or mix it into your sauce, you can really up the nutrition factor while still being able to eat a lot of pizza. And then my final suggestion is soups and stews. Chard is actually an excellent green for soups. It cooks in well. You can throw it in at just the last minute, or you can leave it in earlier because it has more sort of structural integrity than some of the more delicate greens do. So this is something that you can throw into your soup at the beginning or end. It's going to hold together well. Something like a stew that's a bit heartier, maybe go with kale. If you've got a light soup, maybe something that's got kind of a chicken broth or a light vegetable base, maybe throw in some spinach, and that you can put in right at the end because that residual heat will be enough to cook it. It adds color, it adds nutrition, and it's really easy to do without having to go through a lot of extra prep since you don't have to cook it separately. The last thing I'll say is microgreens. Going back to these guys again, these cute little tiny greens are a great garnish. You can throw these on top of virtually anything. Throw them on top of your ramen, throw them on top of your pasta salad, throw them onto a sandwich, sprinkle some on top of a bowl of creamy soup. Eat them by the handful. Add them to a regular salad to add some extra texture. Microgreens are really versatile. You don't have to do a whole bunch of extra chopping and prep beforehand. And they usually have a really good flavor because they are a blend of the other types of greens that I've shown you today. So those are my suggestions on how to use greens without just eating salad all the time. This time of year, our plates can get a little bit on the beige side in Michigan, so it's a great time to come and check out the available greens, a lot of which are actually local because they can be grown in hoop houses and greenhouses this time of year in cold frames in Michigan. Oh, hi Shirley, thanks. So it's something that you can get year-round to add a little bit of variety to our beige winter diets, and it's pretty easy to sneak into different foods in your diet. If you have any suggestions on how you like to use greens, go ahead and throw them in the comments. I'll be posting this video on YouTube if you need to refer back to it later, and I hope you guys are having a beautiful Friday. Bye.